what it means is that, I mean, at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, people often think of African Americans as just those groups of people that came out of the slave trade from straight from Africa to the United States and then became part of the, slavery here, the civil rights movement, the segregation movement, and everything that we're going through today. But the museum is understands that African American history and culture is internationally created.
Welcome to Diversity Dish, where we're dishing on everything diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice related. My name is Sedruola Maruska, and we're bridging the gap between what needs to be said and what needs to be heard. Those individual experiences that are often ignored or simply dismissed. Sometimes I'm dining alone, sometimes I'm dining with friends, and sometimes I'm dining a la carte. No matter how I'm dining, it promises to be delicious. Let's dig in. Haitian-born Joanne Hyppolite, Ph.D., is the Supervisory Museum Curator of the African Diaspora at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, NMAAHC, and the Board President of the Museums Association of the Caribbean. Her interests and expertise lie in African American and Afro-Caribbean material and expressive culture. She curated the Cultural Expressions inaugural exhibition and is co-curator of A Century in the Making, Building the National Museum of African American History and Culture inaugural exhibit for the NMAAHC. She began her museum career in 2004 as the Folklife Curator at the Historical Museum of Southern California, where she researched and presented programs and exhibitions on Miami's multi-ethnic communities. Prior to joining the Smithsonian, she was the Chief Curator at History Miami Museum from 2008 to 2013, where she curated, among others, the exhibitions Black Crossroads, the African Diaspora in Miami, Haitian Community Arts, Necropolis Cristobal Colon, photographs by Raul Rodriguez, and Black Freedom in Florida. She holds a Ph.D. in Literature from the University of Miami, an M.A. in African American Studies from the University of California, Los Angeles, and a B.A. in English and Afro-American Studies from the University of Pennsylvania. Welcome back to Diversity Dish. I'm so glad you decided to come back. My guest today is Joanne Hyppolite. How are you, Joanne?
Doing really, really well. Glad to be here.
Yes, it is so good to see you. Joanne and I knew each other way back when there were no husbands, there were no children. Now we all have all of those things. So, to get into our conversation, I just love to ask the question, what is it that you are most passionate about right now?
So I think it ties into my work as a curator at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And right now I'm working on collecting jewelry from a mid-century modernist designer named Art Smith. He was Jamaican American. He made these beautiful sculptural pieces, like just outstanding, stunning pieces that people often refer to as wearable art. It was the kind of jewelry that was collected by museums, so as well as worn by people on the streets. He had his studio from the 1940s to the late 1970s in Greenwich Village. He was the only known African-American person working in the studio modern jewelry movement. And I just fallen in love with his work, the aesthetic of his work. And I love that I get to, tool around the country looking for examples of the work, purchasing it and helping to build a collection. Eventually I'll do an online exhibition and a couple of articles and potentially a book on him.
Wow. I've never heard of him.
But once you have heard of him, you'll never forget it. And if you Google Art Smith jewelry, you'll see all that amazing work show up. Yeah.
Art Smith jewelry. So I'm going to have to link that in the show notes also so that everybody can do that. So you said that he was probably one of the only African American jewelers in Greenwich Village at that time.
Yeah. He was And interestingly, he was trained by an African American woman named Winifred Mason Shanae, and she had started making jewelry at home, hammering disc, and her stuff really took off. And they worked together at the Children's Aid Society in Harlem, and she introduced him to making jewelry. He'd gone to art school, and so she opened up a shop and hired him as her shop assistant, but he soon far surpassed her and was creating like better work than her, and ended up opening up his own shop, and just really, we created being a master of the form. Yeah.
That is so incredible. And I love that. And so you said that you are now traveling around collecting some of his pieces. Is that to put into the museum as well?
Trying to build a representative collection of his work. He did many, many different types of pieces. And if we're going to do an exhibit in the future, you want to be able to show range.
Right.
The earliest things he might have done, some of the later periods, some of his more outstanding pieces. He was sold all over the country in boutiques, but also in places like Bloomingdale's. So that's why there's so much of his work available, because a lot of people bought it. It was all over. And you can, even today, you might be able to go to a flea market or a vintage store and accidentally stumble on something that that some elderly person probably bought a long time ago, and it ended up at that store, and look on the back of it, look for his signature on the back. And now his stuff goes for over, like his necklaces go for over $20,000 a piece, and his bracelets and earrings are in the 4 or 5 digits as well. Yeah.
Wow.
At the time, he was selling them for about $4.95, $8.95. So, yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, but he was making a living, or a good living, hopefully, on the work that he was doing. And so he didn't die, as some artists do, and even some writers, a pauper because he wasn't making any money, right?
Such a good point for you to bring up, because so many of our Black people who just, commit themselves to the art, right? Sometimes in poverty, like Zora Neale Hurston, the writer, for instance. Well, he was smart, right? Instead of just committing himself to being an artist, and that is what he was and considered himself, and there were many other mid-century jewelry artists, he had a shop, like a little jewelry store, a brick and mortar store. So people were ordering from him. They would come in and have him fix things. They would come in and buy his work, commission work. And that sort of like stable presence of having a jewelry store that people are frequenting, I think made a big difference, as opposed to being at home and having a studio, right? And only creating work that is for collectors or for museums, right? That's a much more of a gambit, I think.
Right. So at the time that he was selling his jewelry, was he also selling to collectors and to museums, or no? Because I guess there's a kind of an incubation period, maybe, or something.
Museums were acquiring and exhibiting his work really early on, because they were starting to recognize that these jewelers were borrowing on modern art principles. Modern art was being shown in a lot of the museums. They started recognizing, hey, look what's going on in this other field. And they started creating exhibits and including his work in it. So that's where the recognition comes from. I think the other really interesting thing about Art Smith, he dovetailed with my work at the museum, because I'm the Supervisory Curator of the African Diaspora. I focus in particular on Black immigrant American communities. And he was a Black immigrant American. His father and mother had moved from Jamaica to Cuba to work on a sugar plantation, right? All these stories that happened a lot in the Caribbean. We had Haitian people also going to Cuba to work as well. And then they moved to Harlem. They were following Garvey, actually, Marcus Garvey, who had started a whole UNIA chapter here. So his father was a lieutenant in the Garvey movement, and that's how they end up here. What's interesting about Art Smith is that he never became a naturalized citizen. So he was undocumented. We use that word a lot today, right? Undocumented, and what that means. Yeah. His mother and his sister became naturalized citizens, but he didn't. And I think it had a lot to do with the fact that he was born in Cuba. So he didn't have the same birth certificate credentials that his sister and his mother had access to. They were born in Jamaica, and Jamaica at that time was under British colonial rule. So you could go back and get the records a lot easier than what Cuba had a revolution. That's my speculation, but there would have been no other reason for him, if his mother and his sister had went for it and did it, for him not to do it himself, unless there was some complication, right?
Right.
And then the complications of being undocumented, meant that he couldn't travel out of the country, right? In case something happened to him. So you never see him though he travels around the United States, you never see him going outside of the country at all. And what a lot of artists do, right? They go to Paris, they go to Germany, they go to other places to study or just to show their work. So I'm interested in those facets as well, like how he lives his life as a Black immigrant American.
Yeah, undocumented.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so interesting. I mean, I can't imagine how the more that you dig into it, the more that you learn how interesting that could be. Because just listening to you talk about it, I'm like, oh my goodness, we don't often think about what happened then, especially as you said, we use that word a lot now. But there were people who spent their whole lives here in this country, who prospered and who contributed and who were quote unquote undocumented, right?
And the rules got stricter and stricter over time, right?
Yeah.
And the terms have changed now. It's even harder now, I think, to live undocumented than it was 40, 50 years ago. Remember, even Social Security numbers didn't get applied until like the mid 1900s. Now it's much more of a controlled sort of state, I think. And Black people have it harder than anybody, right? In terms of getting their citizenship rights, becoming a citizen and getting access to this country, and also getting their rights respected as well.
Absolutely. I remember, and when I had my kids, I had to have their names and I had to apply for their Social Security cards right away. But I didn't get a Social Security card until I was trying to work when I was 16 years old. And I was born in this country, right? Yeah. And so I think when you say that the rules have changed, I've seen that evolution where it's like, oh no, right now you need to do it. Whereas for me, it was like you do it when you need to get a job, then you get your Social Security card and you can exactly work.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember that?
Yeah. And that's a good point. I wonder if that's when I got mine as well, because we're not too far in age. But I remember that at least was when I was presented with it by my mother. Like, now you have to have this, your card carrying, right? Yeah, right. To work in this country, right? Because you can't work without a Social Security card. And here he had a business, right? And no Social Security number, right? So
right. So that's so interesting to me, because that was the precipice. That was the thing that made it so that we had to go get our Social Security card. So I remember my mom taking us to the Social Security Administration, my brother and I, and getting the Social Security card. She figured she'd do them at the same time. I'm 2 years older than my brother. So he got his when he's a little younger than me, before he could work. But she was like, if I'm going to do this, we're just going to do this, everybody together. So yeah, it's so interesting. The rules, like you said, tighter and tighter and tighter. And now it's like I couldn't leave the hospital until I filled out the paperwork for the birth certificate and for the Social Security card. And so all those things came in the mail, around the same time. So my kids have their number, If
you lose it, you can try to get another. There are ways for you to try to get another one. There's a whole process in place, right? It's harder for immigrant Americans because they have to, if they're born in another country. I was also born in another country, and to get my birth certificate, I've got to go to Haiti and do some stuff. Figure out how to get a copy of it. And it takes some work. It's a process.
Yeah. And so yes, you're Haitian American. You were born in Haiti. Okay, I was born here. So you get to work with works from what you said, the immigrant African American population. Hey, thanks for listening. My name is Sedruola Maruska, and I help entrepreneurs and small businesses go from mediocre to magnificent by transforming their cultures to be more equitable and inclusive. To find out how we can work together, go to diversitydish.com, where you'll find my consulting, coaching, and speaker information. diversitydish.com. I look forward to working with you.
Yeah, I have a really cool job. I'm the Supervisory Curator of the African Diaspora. And what's the African Diaspora, right? It's every Black country in this world.
That's right.
Moving out of Africa, so it's way too big a term, right? For anything. But what it means is that, I mean, at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, people often think of African Americans as just those groups of people that came out of the slave trade straight from Africa to the United States and then became part of the, slavery here, the civil rights movement, the segregation movement, and everything that we're going through today. But the museum is understands that African American history and culture is internationally created, that there were always these 6 waves of immigrants, Black immigrants coming into the country, whether it was because of the Haitian Revolution or slaves being seized in the Caribbean and then becoming part of the United States, or successive waves of migration. It was a large migration from the English Caribbean in the early 19th century, and certainly the Haitian migration, and then the big one in the 1970s. And these people become part of Black America. And they often contribute to a lot of what are considered Black movements and Black freedom movements, Black studies as well. So really, African American roots are very, very diverse. Whatever you call yourself, and you can call yourself whatever you want. There's nothing wrong with that. I can call myself Haitian American, or I could choose to call myself African American, depending on how I define it. That's up to you, like what you want to call yourself. And we recognize that as well. But we're interested in making sure that people understand the diversity of African Americanness. And so it's my job and several other people's at the museums to point out that we didn't all come from the same place, right? Some of us had some stops in different places before we got here, and that informs our identity, our identity as well, and our culture as well.
Yeah. And that's so important because, we spend a lot of time, and when I say we, I mean Black people, Black Americans, African Americans, we spend a lot of time defending the fact and the idea that we are not a monolith, right? We have an experience that many of us can relate to but we each live our own experiences, and they're often informed by the people who came before us, where we came from, what was that history. And so, in order to be truly equitable and truly inclusive, you have to understand that just because someone presents as a Black person, don't think that you know everything about them, because they have a varied history just like everybody else, right?
Yeah, they have different geographical roots, and people are very different around the country, right? We don't all talk the same in different parts of the country. We don't eat the same foods in different parts. Just this country alone, we may be at class issues, bring some differences between us, where our parents came from. We are very diverse. Yeah, absolutely. And so it's very important at this museum that is brought out, and not, condense everything to one thing.
Yeah. So you are researching this, and you're expecting that a book will come out at some point. Is that a book that you're going to be writing on the information that you're gathering on him?
Yeah, I hope to do an online exhibition and then at least a catalog. So it'll be the book will be a catalog that will showcase some of his work and talk about his life and his culture.
Nice. I love that. So what other projects have you worked on? How long have you been there at the African American Museum?
Since 2014. So I came to the museum field right after graduate school. In 2004. I just graduated with the Ph.D. and I took a position as the Folklife Curator at History Miami Museum, which is right in downtown Miami. And that was great because I was doing a lot of community research. I was focused on the different ethnic communities in Miami. Talk about diversity, right? Diaspora differences there, and figuring out their tradition. Folk life is very much about traditions and traditional culture. So looking around what was going on in those communities and collecting artifacts related to it and creating exhibitions. So I remember I created an exhibition that I loved working on called Haitian Community Arts. And we actually spent time just talking to community members about, like, okay, you got to get that communion dress made. Who is the person you go to get it sewed? Who's the one who's really well known? Who are the bakers in town that you think make the best pate and make the best the cakes for every occasion? The artists, the musicians that you hire. And so it was a community led in the exhibition. We were listening to the voices of the community about who their
Mm-hmm.
artisans are, and created that. And then I did another exhibition called Black Crossroads, the African Diaspora in Miami, where we focused on all the different Black communities in Miami: Jamaican, Trinidadian, Bahamian, African American, mainly. Those
Mm-hmm.
are the five largest ones. And we also did Afro-Cubans as well.
Mm-hmm.
And we talked about where they had come from and where they landed in Miami, what their community structures were, their churches, their neighborhoods, their aspirations. So it was great. That was a good exhibition as well. And it was great for learning all of those communities and putting them all together in one place. And then in 2014, I had started looking around for more work. I think I was done with what I was doing at History Miami, and I was just looking for other opportunities. And I think everyone who's a curator knew that this museum was being built, the National Museum of Africa, and everyone was trying to get a job. And every once in a while, I would look on the employment website for the Smithsonian and be like, they're looking for a religion curator. That's not me. Oh, they're looking for like a slavery curator. That's not what I do. And then it's just so funny. I had gone to the Smithsonian on a family visit, and this museum had a short-term gallery in the National Museum of American History, and I went to see it, and they had a great show called The Changing America. That was fantastic. And I left saying, see, I really want to work for this museum. And then I went online that night, and there was the position for African Diaspora, and I said, that's me.
That's me.
That's me. So then because everything I'd been doing at History Miami was about working with, multi-ethnic communities and multi-ethnic Black communities.
Yeah.
And so I applied and I came on board in April 2014, 2 years before we opened. Yeah.
Nice. Wow. And so since you've been there, what are some of the exhibits that you've worked on? So this one, and also when did this one start? Like when did you start working on this one, but what have you worked on before?
So the Artsmith project is really just a research project right now,
Okay.
and a collecting initiative and a research project. It'll be an exhibition further on down the road. You have to have something to show when you have an exhibition, which is why I'm building the collection right now, like a representative collection. I curated the permanent exhibition. Permanent means it's going to be up for a long time, 10 years or more. Exhibition called Cultural Expressions, which is located on the 4th floor of the museum, which is where all our cultural galleries are. And Cultural Expressions looks at 5 ways in which African Americans express culture. So the 5 ways are foodways, culture and cuisine, language, power of the word, artistry, craftsmanship and creativity, social dance and gesture, and style, image, and identity. And if you think about it, I was giving people a very broad introduction to culture in general, what culture is. And I always thought of it like a guidebook, City. Like if you were going to a different country, Jamaica or Germany or anywhere, you would hear the language. What you would hear would be different, right? So language, power of the word, the way people sound and the things they say. So I looked at that, like how does sound and language work in African American communities? And then we talked about that monolith thing, right? It's not all the same. Like if you go in the Gullah Geechee communities, you're hearing a whole different sound, right?
Yes.
You were in the 1940s in Harlem and you were hearing Harlem slang, that would have been a different sound. There's the whole African American English vernacular. There's the way preachers talk when they're at church. So we explore like sound and language, orality and language, power of the word. And the same thing in all of the other areas as well. Looked at food geographically, the diversity and the range. With style, we talk about skin color and politics of skin color, but also beauty, the fact that beauty practices of African Americans have, and the fashion industry, artistry and craftsmanship. So going back to this idea of a guidebook, right? When you go to a different country, you're likely to see the people dressed differently, right? So what are the stylistics of that community? If you may go to a craft market at the museum and see the products that, and the artistry that's them. So that's the artistry section. And then social dance and gesture, we all have our own different dance styles in different countries, right? And what we do here. And then the food obviously is the easiest one to people know when you travel: foodways, culture, and cuisine. Oh, I feel like I missed one. Oh, it doesn't matter. But
music?
Yeah, maybe it was we did dance and social gesture. Well, it doesn't matter. But that's how cultural expressions works. That's what you experience when you come into that gallery on that floor. It's a lot of fun. It was a lot of fun to curate, but it's also just a great gallery in general. Visually, it's got a lot of color in it and a lot of great artifacts.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to being able to go to see all the exhibits there. because I've been trying to get there for a few years. Every time I go on, the tickets are sold out.
Uh, yeah, we're
Yeah,
the
and
only
it
Smithsonian museum that requires a ticket to get into.
yes,
Problem to have.
yes, yes, it is. And I know because when we went in April, we didn't have to have tickets for the other ones. We just
Mhm.
showed up.
Yeah.
Or maybe you had to do a time slot for some of them, but you showed up and it was fine. That was the only one where you had to have a ticket, which is good, I think. Like you said, I think it says a lot. It says that it's in great demand. People really are interested and they want to see these exhibits. They want to experience this. They want to know more. And so you kind of have to regulate how many people are in there. Otherwise there'll be no movement.
We actually broke the rules for like how long people stay in a museum. There are actually people who study what people do in museums. The visitor evaluation studies is what they're called. So curators and other people can do a better job of planning for people in the
Mhm.
spaces. And so they watch what people do, how long they stay, and all those things. And so maybe if you're lucky, someone will stay in a museum anywhere for 2 hours. People were staying in our museum 6 hours or more. Yeah, it's so they were being tracked, so we could tell that, right? And so because of that, it also meant that we could give less tickets because the capacity was full, right? And you can only give so
Yeah,
much and turn it over. And we also have a higher number of people who it's their first visit to a museum ever that come into our museum.
really.
Mhm.
Wow. And why do you think that is?
I think that the story, like people really want to understand race in this country and African American history and culture, and everybody feels connected to it in one way or another, right? For
Yeah,
the
yeah.
history of this country, or someone they may know, right? Or
Hmm.
something they've seen on television that they don't understand. And they're
Yeah.
hoping when they come here to sort of get, enlightened or to connect with something or yeah, and it's been an amazing journey for the museum and obviously much needed, right? It took over 100 years to build this museum, but we've proven that it was really needed. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. So going back a little bit, so when you say that you're curating, this information, where do you start? Like where do you start to start curating about the food and about the language and about the music and about the dance? Where do you start?
So that's a great question. Curators are subject area specialists in any area that they've studied. Most of the time, they have a master's or a PhD in the area that they've studied in. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and and so they've already got like the studies in a particular area. So if I was a food curator, I'd have food studies and I would have studied African American food in particular and looked at the history of African American food over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
From the beginning of this country to the present day. And then I might choose to specialize on a particular period or a particular cuisine, geographic
Mm-hmm.
cuisine, right? And
Mm-hmm.
grow that specialization. So we already, each of us, and there are curators in everything. There are curators in botany at the Smithsonian. There are curators in like pests. There are curators of dinosaurs, curators of aviation. So any topic at all, you can be a curator
Yeah.
of. So we start with that, right? What we know already about a particular subject and topic. And then we also we try to make sure we bring visitor input in. We try to understand what the audience knows about something too, because you need to meet them where they're at. Like you can't go
Mm-hmm.
so high that they don't understand something, and you can't go
Mm-hmm.
too low that it's too basic for them as well. So you try to find that sweet spot in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
So curators, when they create their exhibitions, they try to think about educational messages. What is it that I want people to know after they've walked out of this space? And then they try to layer the content that they have around those educational messages. So back to your question about where do you start, right? There's always too much more than you can show, right? There's not much more that but you have at least a storyline based on the beginning of African American culture to the contemporary day about food. There's a storyline that exists from your studies, right? And
Yeah.
then you've got to figure out what you've got to show, because an exhibition is very different from a book or an article where you can just write all the stuff and give them all the content. You actually have to have an artifact to actually
Mm-hmm.
tell the story, to shape the story around. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of what we did at the beginning of cultural expressions was looked for artifacts that fit into the time periods and the cuisines, for instance, in foodways, culture and cuisine that we wanted to represent. So we looked at Creole cuisine in that section, and
Mm-hmm.
we had to think about, well, who were the chefs during that period of time? Who were the more significant ones, and what material culture exists around them? Are there any of their pots, their restaurant menus, store signs available to help tell the story of them, helping to create Creole cuisine and making it the popular American cuisine that it is today.
Wow. So then when you start looking for these artifacts to show, to kind of tell the story, where do you go? How do you find them?
Yeah, it's a great question. Sometimes people find us. We have a process
Mm,
online where people can offer something to donate to us, and it
okay.
gets sent to whatever curator whose area it is, and we evaluate it. And some really great things have been donated to us because people saved their like great grandmother's, freedom papers, right? Or
Oh,
their, the wedding dress that their mother had commissioned from African American designer Ann Lowe, who's a major designer. So people who
right.
save items, we're trained to be able to look at something and say, this is significant. Yes, we want this. So that's
Yes.
great that people feel like this is an important thing. I know it's important because my mother told me it was important. My great grandmother was important. This is important to Black history. So I'm going to offer it to the museum so it has a safe place to live forevermore, because the museum lived beyond you, right? It lives
Yeah.
beyond me. It goes 100 years later. And then there's lots of things available at auction, believe it or not. African American
Mm,
memorabilia, old letters, photographs, papers that belong to famous writers and actors. And think about all the
yeah.
famous people in the world today and how everyone wants to own a piece of them, right? So they might want to,
Yeah.
yeah, like the costume worn by the Jackson Five on a particular show. You could buy that at a music auction, actually.
Right.
So we do acquisitions that way. And there are also lots of private collectors. So there are people who have a specialization, and it may be in art, or they may want to collect like war memorabilia, and they've
Hmm.
built really strong collections, and we can often go to them once we know who they are and ask to purchase something from their collection or ask them to donate something from their collection. It's one
Right.
of the things is like, if you don't have an artifact, you don't have a story, and that can be really hard because you might have a story you really want to tell, but there's
Yeah.
nothing to show. And I can write about it, but I can't put it on exhibit. That's not good enough. Yeah.
Right. Right. Now, so when you say that you were writing about it, so you said that you were wanting to create this book.
Mhm.
Is this also part of your job? Your,
Yeah.
are you expected to write about
Yeah.
the exhibits that you're curating?
Yeah, curators are definitely scholars and are supposed to contribute to the dissemination of knowledge. So what we know, we're supposed to write scholarly articles and publish them in journals and about what we know. The Smithsonian publishes many books, so we may be
Mhm.
asked to write an article about one thing or another, a topic that's being put into a book, and we do that for them as well. So if you think about it, curators are often the complement to what university professors are doing, except we do it for
Yeah.
museums. Yeah.
Tha-
And
That's
we
what
do it
I
for
was
the
gonna
general
say.
public. Yeah.
That's what I was gonna say, because my husband is a professor, and he,
Ah,
he has to continue to do things, write articles, or he's a writer, so he's written a book,
that's great.
he's written screenplays and things like that. And so when you said that, I'm like, well, it's just like being a professor, except that you don't necessarily do it in front of a class. You do it for the
Yes.
museum,
For the general
um,
public too, for the
and for
people who
the
are coming
right,
to see it. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, yeah. So do you ever present yourself to the public? Like present on any of the things that you've been working on?
Sure. I mean, in many different ways, I do VIP tours for the museum. I often get called to talk on scholarly conferences and panels, or museum conferences, of which there are many, many, and panels.
Mm.
I think I just got an invitation, for instance, to speak at there's a French Immigration Museum in Paris, and
Oh,
they want to look at how museums around the world are dealing with immigration. And so because I focus on Black immigrant Americans, I would come to that conference this October. I think it's when it's supposed to be held, and talk about what our museum is doing.
I want to be a curator now.
It's a fun job. It's a fun job.
It sounds like a fun job. I mean, it sounds like a fun job. It sounds like a lot of work because, of course, you have to do a lot of the legwork and all of the research and all of that. But if those are things that you really like doing, it sounds like a really fun job to
It
me.
is. It is. It's a lot of work. You're right, because it can be. There's a lot of research involved in acquiring an object, Someone could come to you and tell you, a really good example is that I brought in Zora Neale Hurston's graduation robe a few years ago. And that's because I also have a specialization in literature, so Black immigrant Americans, but also literature. And so we had to prove that it was her robe. Like, that's a lot of research trying to figure that out, you know?
Yeah.
It was a story behind this robe that she had bought it and she was supposed to wear it to her graduation at Barnard, and she didn't ever, she ended up having to go to the South and do research. So she sold the robe to a classmate. And it was the classmate had then held on to it, wore it to her graduation and then held on to it forever. And then on her deathbed, she gifted it to someone else whose name was Zora as well. So this person comes to us with this story and she says, I have Zora Neale Hurston. And we're like, how do we know this is true? Right? Like, this is such a story. Like, how do we find out? But can you imagine the amount of research, reading all of Zora's materials and letters, trying to prove that she did give this robe to this person, and trying to legitimize that this person is a smart, truthful person as well, and knows what she's saying and is not trying to fool us into paying for something. We didn't have to pay it. It was a donation, by the way. We also had to have textile conservators look at it and backdate the robe to make sure it was from that time period. There's lots of fancy things they do. They look at thread, they look at cloth, they look at styles of gowns during that period of time. So this was an interesting conundrum because we never saw anywhere. Zora writes that she didn't attend her graduation. That's documented. But she never talks about what she did to her robe. Right. But what I could find out was that Zora Neale Hurston had a habit of selling everything when she was broke and she needed to go somewhere. She would sell her own typewriter, so it was conceivable that she could have sold her robe. The robe itself had been altered, so it was for a taller person, which Zora Neale Hurston was, and then had been altered for a smaller person, so that helped as well. The person who gave it to us ended up to be, a really smart, very interesting person who worked with Indian affairs and traditional culture. She had no reason to make up this story. She wasn't like a Zora, fan chaser, yeah. So she, all the things. So what we found was that we couldn't prove that it wasn't true, which is what we were looking for as much as that it was true, like holes in the story. And that was good enough because oftentimes with Black people, there isn't enough documentation, right? Their stuff doesn't get saved in the archives as much as the white colonial stories and artifacts. And so oral history is very important in our communities, just as much as anything you can find on paper. We could not prove that, could not put a single hole in the story. And that was good enough. That was enough for us to say this. And also, it also had Z and H, like there was a label in the gown that had Z and H on it. So her initials had been sewn in, and the textile conservator proved that those initials were from way back when. So we also had that as a piece of evidence. Yeah. But that took a lot of work. It took almost a year to read through everything, get all those things processed, talk to people. And that's just one item. We bring in thousands of objects a year. So.
That's what I was just thinking. I was like, oh my gosh, and that was just like one thing. So
that was just one. Yeah. So we call that provenance in the museum world. What's the provenance? What's the story of the object? We have to do sometimes a lot of provenance history. We're so thrilled when someone comes to us and they have all of the information and all of the proof, It's like, yes, it was this time and it was this date and this person gave it. And here's my receipts for it. And that the first time people buy things and throw away receipts. So.
We should learn, keep our receipts. So as you're doing your research now with art, you have to go through the same process, I'm sure, to verify that the pieces that you're receiving are actually his pieces. And so did he sell them with paperwork or anything, or how do you know for sure?
And that's a good question, because there are people out there making fake Artsmith jewelry because they know it sells very well. So, and they know people will buy it because it's a collectible right now.
Right.
He had a stamp that he used to mark most of his jewelry. That helps. You have to make sure that the jewelry is stamped, but even that could be made up. So we often go to reputable dealers, people we know who are specialists in selling. They can look at it and tell you whether it's real or not.
Right.
That's what we try for. And then also You can also go to conservators as well, particularly conservators who look at metal, because that's what he worked in copper and brass, silver and gold, and can help tell you the age of an item. So if someone just made it a couple of years ago because they're trying to sell you a fake, you can kind of guess.
Right.
Yeah.
And trying to make it look old.
Right, trying to make it look old, exactly. Sure, that's like the nightmare that I would bring something into the museum and then later, spend $20,000 and later realize it's like, oh, it's a fake.
Yeah.
It probably happens all the time, though. It does, because people are always trying to scam.
Yeah, I would imagine that it does, and that's why you have to go through the whole process as much as possible in order to make sure, because of course that's also that goes to credibility, right? It goes to the credibility of the institution or to the curator as well, right?
Right, exactly. No, it's a big problem, actually.
Yeah.
Art world fakes, as they're called.
Wow, I love what you do. I'm like, so my niece is thinking about being a curator, becoming a curator. So Rudy's daughter, youngest daughter, she just finished up her first year of college. She's going to her second year next year, but she's actually right now interning at the Basquiat exhibit that's going on in Chelsea. So
I so want to see that. I wonder how long that'll be up for. Yeah.
Oh, it's awesome. And I think that it's supposed to be through the summer. So at least through August, but it's really is awesome. So I think you should see it. I think you would love it. But yeah, I think about that and I'm like, I think that I see her doing it because I think that she's definitely into doing, figuring things out, doing the research, very meticulous, very smart. So I'm now very excited for her.
Does she know what area she wants to study yet?
I think she just decided that she wanted to do this because she went in not knowing what she wanted to do. Right. So I think she's still probably trying to figure out which areas she wants to go into. But you know what? I'll connect the two of you and you can have a good chit chat and see, because I think that she would gain a lot from you as well.
Yeah, most people when they think curator, they think art. Curators only do art, but there's so many different.
Yeah, so many types of curators. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think she's focusing on art right now. And so, yeah.
And that's important because there aren't enough Black curators. There have been scandals, over the past few years about the fact that there's so little, right? And that institutions, predominantly white institutions, haven't been hiring people of color to do the work, and yet they represent the work, they buy the work, they interpret the work. So it's been particularly big in the African museum field, art field, because all these white people curating African art, right? And there's also all these issues with whether the art, is legit or not, was legitimately acquired or not, and making sure you have those perspectives, those important nuances, cultural nuances represented. And so there's a real change in the field going on right now. They're looking very closely at bringing that representation up. There are lots of fellowships now and other types of opportunities for people of color to learn curating or practice curating. So it's a good time to do it.
That's good to know. That's good information to know. Would you happen to know where someone can go to get more information about that, or if there's like a place that they can find out? How would you find out?
Yeah, there's an American, I think if she's interested in visual art, there's an American Art Association, and they will post opportunities there. In New York, there's the Caribbean Cultural Institute, has one that's specific for Caribbean art curators.
Okay.
But there are organizations like the American Association of Museums, the Museum Associations of the Caribbean that share when people are looking for or soliciting or putting out an application for those kind of opportunities.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that information. I think that'll be helpful. Is there anything that you would like to bring forth that we haven't really talked about, but that you feel would be really important information for people to have?
Something else that I'm really involved in right now is the Museum Associations of the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of museum associations, and what these associations are places where professionals can come and network, right? They can come and learn from each other, learn about different resources in the field. So there's an American Association of Museums, there's a Mid-Atlantic Association of Museums, Canadian Association, UK Association of Museums. But there's one also called the Museum Associations of the Caribbean, which I got involved with in 2016. And they're pan-regional, and they also look at the Caribbean diaspora as well. So that's where I fill in. And what they're trying to do is sort of look at the museum needs within the Caribbean region, or if you have a museum that has a Caribbean interest in its diaspora region. The Caribbean has its own very particular story history, in the world of being. They have many diverse cultures as well. They have to tell stories that are unique to their geography, to there are many different identities there, and yet it's one of the places where there aren't a lot of museum studies programs or schools. People often have to leave their islands to go study if they're going to study museum work and museum studies, and then they may not come back, right? So what happens if you're a museum worker in those countries at, a heritage fort that you're working at, or at the art gallery there? How do you learn about your field and learn how to do it better and have colleagues that you can network with, right? So that you can mentor you. So that's what the Museums Associations of the Caribbean does. It creates that space. And a lot of it, one of our signature events is a conference that we run almost every year. It's always on a Caribbean country typically, and people come together. They talk about the work that they're doing in their different spaces. They talk about projects that other people can learn from. They get to know each other. And then we spend a lot of time in the country's museums, like getting to know the museums in the region and all the cultural heritage sites. So the tours are always a big part of the conference. That's a lot of fun. But it's also just been a space of affirmation for museum workers in the Caribbean, and which are often smaller than spaces that you see in the United States, and sometimes more under-resourced as well. So it's important to build up that sector there, because they have important stories to tell about their countries, their history, their contributions, right? To all kinds of cultural forms as well.
Yeah. Wow, that sounds really amazing, like a really great program, because there's so many things we don't think about. That basically things that we just take for granted here in this country. We take for granted that, there's museum systems and people have museums, and people can work in museums and and all of that. We don't take into account, when you're talking about a smaller country, that the resources might be less, and that there might not be the access necessary to flourish. And so I think that sounds like an amazing endeavor, or an amazing thing to have. Everybody knows that they can get into art and have some kind of pathway that will allow them to learn as much as possible about their country, whatever it is that they're wanting to curate.
Yeah, and that they're sustaining and showcasing cultural heritage in their area, right? Which that's what museums often do. They safeguard cultural heritage, in the end. And so if there aren't people doing that good work, then a lot of that great material culture, but also that great history in terms of its objects, right? Its art and its artifacts can get lost. And that's really a loss for our country. Yeah, it's just a sad thing when you see its cultural heritage is not available to them anymore, for them to look back at and see and understand where they've come from, right? And where they're going as well. And or what even people thought in terms of art. What I love about art in particular is that people are, processing what's going on in the world today sometimes with art, and showing you their interpretations of it. And if you don't have those stories and, to tell, because the work is gone, right? Or the work is not being well cared for or maintained, or properly cared properly, because there's lots of ways you have to take care of artifacts so they last forever, properly conserved. Then you have cultural heritage at risk, right?
Yeah, it's like endangered species.
Yes, exactly.
we don't want to lose them, and we don't want to lose that information. It's so important.
They tell us a lot about ourselves. It really does.
Yeah, it really does.
Yeah. So we love at museums, we love the pack rats who don't throw anything away, even though they're hard to live with if that's your spouse or your mother, right? So goodness
Right.
gracious, the people who like keep things like, like army uniforms that they should have thrown away like years ago because they had 20 of them, but they were
Yeah.
an African American war veteran in World War II. Like, what if all of them threw their uniforms away, right? So no.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, no, we have to keep it so that we can see
You were part of
and
history. Yeah.
such a huge part of history. Such a huge part of history.
Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I love it. See, this is why I do what I do. I get all these new perspectives, new information, new ideas, and this has been no different. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me today and for sharing. I mean, it's just so interesting, such interesting. I cannot wait to see the Art Smith work that you do coming down the line. And like you said, now that I know the name, I'm definitely going to have to go look up and see what's out there and see if I've ever seen it before and not known that I've seen it before.
Yeah, that's true too.
Yeah. So before I let you go, I would like to know, what is your favorite dish?
So I'll tell you that I'm currently obsessed with croissants.
I love it.
And it's funny, I'm going to France next week and I'm like, oh my God, I have to get croissants every day. But not all croissants are created equal, right? There's some really bad croissants out there. And I don't want to name some stores, but some stores you should not get croissants out of the big box stores in particular. Okay. There's an art to making a croissant with the multi-layers of the pastry.
Yes. The
And
flaky.
yes. And it should be eaten in one day, ideally. So it's got to have the right kind of crunch and bite to it, right? So I'm obsessed with like really good croissants. And I'm almost glad when I taste bad ones, I'm like, no, okay, never here again. So I'm making a list of places that have good croissants, right? But, and then related to the croissant, of course, in my culture is the Haitian pâté, right?
Yeah.
I love a good Haitian pâté. It's often an appetizer. For those you don't know, it's an appetizer. Often you'll find at a party or an event. And it also has the multi-layered sort of crusty pastry. And inside there is usually meat or fish, or that's been ground up and cooked inside of it. Sometimes chicken, and it's so good. And also, it's not done well. There are people who complain about the good pâtés versus bad pâtés.
Haitians will not let you get away with a bad pâté. They'll be like,
they'll talk for days. Yes. My mother in particular, because she lives in Miami where there are many bakeries, right? She will tell you which bakeries not to go to. No, they don't do good pâté there. Do not bring her a pâté from there, and don't go to that one. So she has her approved list.
That's hilarious. And she'll be asking you like, "Qui côté wash the pâté ça?"
Yeah,
like, where did you buy this pâté? And if you tell her, she'll be like, pas besoin ça.
Yes,
I don't need it.
Oh, the derogatory.
No shame. They be like, I'm good.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'm like, and I used to not be as picky as her, but now I just follow her lead. I'm like, and it is about the leaves. They call the leaves the layers of the pastry, right? Yes. Whether it's cooked all the way through and you get the different, so pâtés and croissants.
Yes. Oh, I love it. Thank you so much. It has been such a pleasure having you. It's such a pleasure seeing you again. I'm so glad that you were able to do this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, did you enjoy that episode? If so, please leave a review. It would mean the world, but only if it's a good one and you really did enjoy it. In which case, it would be awesome if you help support my work over at patreon.com/Sedruola Maruska. And finally, before you go, don't forget diversitydish.com. I'd love to work with you. See you soon.